Evening. Last week we began our new series in this book, and if you will recall, the book of Ecclesiastes is a part of the Bible's wisdom literature, which means there are different categories or different types of books in the Bible. We have historical books like Esther or the book of Acts. We have the Gospels, which focus on the life of Christ. We have the prophets. We have the Psalms. Well, Ecclesiastes is a part of the wisdom literature. Also, certain books in this group would be the book of Job, would be Proverbs. So these different books that are teaching us to implement principles of proper wisdom. So it's teaching you how to actually apply these things so that you can live a more wise life, a life that would honor God. And so we look at the very beginning of the book, and it says that it's the words of the preacher. And if you will recall, in the Hebrew, that word, the preacher, is koheleth. And the word koheleth literally just means the one who addresses the assembly. Now, we know that in the New Testament, the word for assembly is ecclesia, right? And that's the word that we get church. That's what church means. It literally just means ecclesia or assembly. And so what many have done, and as they translate this, coming back, they say that it's the preacher because he is the one who is addressing the congregation or the assembly, and so that's where we get the word Ecclesiastes from that word ecclesia, so for the one who's addressing that assembly. So Ecclesiastes from this preacher. So these are the words of the preacher, and you might be, well, who is this preacher? Well, in verse 1 of the book, it says it's the son of David and the king in Jerusalem. And so there's been a couple of different theories of who maybe this is referring to. The most common in the traditional view is that this is King Solomon. That means that would be David's immediate son who took the throne in Jerusalem. But there are some other thoughts that maybe this is another king who's just referring to himself as a descendant of this line or this kingdom of David. And then there's some that hold that maybe it's a later scribe who is taking on the persona of Solomon, and he's kind of teaching a moral lesson or teaching wisdom through Solomon as the example. So even though it's not technically Solomon, he's still writing as Solomon. However, I think that the message is still the same, and I think that if we take it as Solomon, as many have before, we can see this as actually Solomon teaching us how to implement wisdom in our lives from his own personal experience. Because as many of us know, Solomon started out great as a king, but then he actually started to embrace a lot of prodigal living and started seeking pleasures of the world and started marrying foreign women and embracing foreign gods and worshiping false idols and things like that. And it caused a lot of problems in his life and in his reign. And so many have taken this to be maybe this is a book that reveals Solomon's his repentance at the end of his life, where he's reflected on his foolishness, and now what he's doing is he's actually encouraging the reader to now see what he's done and learn from his mistakes and say, these are things you don't have to actually go and search and seek out for yourself. Rather, I've made the mistakes for you, now learn from me, is maybe a way to think of it. And so, as he begins this book now, and I'm so thankful to see that after I gave this message last week that I didn't make everyone so depressed that they didn't want to come back, but the book begins in verse 2, after he addresses who he is, the preacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. He then says that basically everything is vanity. He says, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And so that's what he did at the very beginning of this book, is he kind of just gives us a map of what the rest of the book's going to be about. And he's going to be saying how everything in this life that we see under the sun, which those two phrases are going to be used repeatedly in the book, vanity as well as things under the sun. He's saying basically all of this is vanity. Everything that we can see and hear and touch and look at. And the word vanity, though it might be translated in some people's Bibles as meaningless, vanity or the word in the Hebrew actually is hevel. And what hevel actually means is it means vapor or smoke or breath. So if you can just imagine, right? So like if you are walking outside on a cold day and you just breathe and you see the air and it is there for a moment and then it just kind of dissipates, right? Or if you think about smoke, right? You blow out a candle and you see the smoke and it's there for a second and then it kind of just fades away. He says, likewise, that is what life is like. It's here for a moment and then it's gone the next. It's the breath of life, right? So he's going to emphasize the brevity of life, and then he's actually going to go even further and say not only is it brief, right? Not only is it short, but it's elusive, like trying to grab onto that smoke, right? You can't actually grab it, right? You can see it, it's really there, but as you try to grab onto it, it's gone. So he makes the point that life is hevel in the sense that it's short, that it's elusive, and also that it's repetitive. And if you'll remember, he went through the cycles of nature, right? How like the sun goes around and around, and how the wind goes back and forth, and then likewise how the sea is constantly being filled by the rivers. And it just seems like there's this ongoing process, but it never comes to a conclusion. And he compares that to the human life, likewise how we as humans have this cycle that we just go through, right, day to day, and it seems like we're just stuck on this monotonous realm that is under the sun that just seems to have no ultimate fulfillment or satisfaction. And so what he's going to be then addressing and answering is, so what is the meaning of life, right? So what's the point of all this? Why are we toiling and working so hard under the sun if all of this seems to be vanity, or it seems to be hevel, short, elusive, and repetitive? So that's the question that he has. And as we're going to look now, he's going to start explaining not only in the general realm in the sense of all is vanity. Now he's going to get to the specific examples, and he's going to start to explain how he looked in this area, how he looked in that area. And as you try to make meaning or try to find fulfillment and satisfaction out of this thing, you find that ultimately it's still vanity, or it's still hevel. And so obviously the whole point as he goes through this book is to say, if you keep looking under the sun, you're not going to find it. So it's going to have to push you to look what is beyond the sun, what transcends the sun. And we know, as we looked last time, God is the one who rules over the sun. And so our ultimate fulfillment, satisfaction, ultimate meaning is going to be found in God and God alone. And so that is what we have to learn from this book. So now let us go to verse 12 is where we'll begin this evening, and we're going to read to the end of this chapter of Ecclesiastes 1. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness, and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge, and I set my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is grasping for the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases in knowledge increases in sorrow. So as you see, this chapter ends on a high note with sorrow, as it's continuing this theme of vanity, right? All right, so what we see in verse 12 is it kind of gives us almost like a repeat at the beginning of the book, where we're once again reminded, I, the preacher, this is Koheleth, right, the one who's addressing the assembly, most likely Solomon. He is the one writing this book. These are his words, and it says, the king over Israel in Jerusalem. So once again, giving us that connection of who he is. And what it does is it starts to explain his search for meaning. He says, I've been struggling with this. All is vanity. I've been working and toiling, and I'm not seeing any purpose with all the meaningless cycles of life. So I'm going to go on a search. I'm going to seek and search, and I'm going to see what the meaning of life is. And if you look in verses 12 to 14, what he does is he explains that he searches for meaning through the pursuit of worldly wisdom. So that's his first route. He's like, surely the way that I will find the meaning of life is going to be through pursuing wisdom. I want to see what the greatest thinkers, the philosophers, the theologians, all of these different scientists, right? All of the thinkers of the day, I'm going to see what all of the world's wisdom has, and then I'm going to find what the meaning of life is through these thinkers, through human wisdom. And as we see this, anyone with, if you're thinking who would be best suited to do this search, I think that it's great that we have it being Solomon, right? So if we had to say, all right, we want someone to seek all of the world's wisdom, right? All of the world's knowledge, put it together, and then come to the conclusion, all right, so what's the point of life? Like, what's the meaning of life? I think Solomon's probably the best candidate to do it. Now, why? Well, in verse 12, if you remember, it says that he was the king over Israel, right? And also Solomon was a very successful king when it came to wealth, right? All of this riches. So think about this. Solomon had the wealth and the freedom as king to search the vastness of worldly wisdom, right? Because there, if you have someone that's a laborer, or many of us, right, if we're working all the time, we don't have a lot of freedom and don't have the resources or the money, right, or the time to get all of that information. But him as the king is actually nicely suited to say he has the wealth, the means, and the freedom to get this information. And so we see that's one good reason to have Solomon as the person that went for this search for meaning and through wisdom. But not only that, but we also, I'm sure many of us are aware that Solomon, he had wisdom that was superior to all others, right? So in verse 13, we see that it says here, he says, I had set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom, right? So that's what he thinks of first off. We also see in verse 16, he says, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem, right? So this is not only him saying this, but we also know in Scripture, it backs it up. Not only is he someone that thinks about wisdom first, is he someone that as he's looking, he recognizes that he has wisdom that is exceeding all other men, but we actually see it being backed up in 1 Kings chapter 3. Verse 12, it says, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. This is God speaking to Solomon. There will be no one like him in wisdom or understanding either before or after him. Likewise in 1 Kings chapter 4, so just the next chapter over, verse 29 to 30, and God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. So now this is the guy that we're talking about went on this search for us, that's writing this book for us, is he's saying he has all the wealth, he has all the freedom, he has all the resources, and now he's been given the greatest amount of wisdom that any man has ever had. So like I said, this is a great candidate for like, all right, give us the answer, right? So as we see then, we see that we have the right candidate, and it also would seem like we have the right pursuit, right? Because the pursuit of wisdom seems to be a very wise, right? It seems to be wise, and it seems to be a noble pursuit, right? To think, I'm going to go pursue wisdom, right? I'm going to go seek after wisdom. And I know many of us probably know this, but Proverbs 4:7 says, wisdom is the principal thing. That is the main thing. Therefore, get wisdom. In all you're getting, get understanding. So you would think, hey, this is the right thing to do, right? This is a smart guy, a wise guy. He's got all the things that he needs to do it, and he's going to go and pursue it. And I'm sure many of us probably have thought in this line of thinking that wisdom is the principal thing, right? In fact, if you think about what distinguishes us between all of creation, it's that we are rational creatures, right? Right? If you look at the plants, they don't think, they don't use wisdom. They don't write books or read books. They don't sing, right? They don't, have all these complexities that we have. Likewise, even the animals who might be, they're animate, they move, and they do certain things. But when it comes to like actually thinking about righteousness and sin and justice and these, abstract concepts, just animals don't have the ability that we have. So that actually, if you think about it, wisdom is what separates us from everybody else. Is that we actually can think. We can make decisions morally and intellectually. And also, I think many of us, as we think about wisdom, we believe that, through education and through knowledge, it can lead us to a better life with happiness and success, right? I'm sure many of us have probably taught our kids to go to school, to work hard, right, to learn. I'm sure many of us did it. Some of you probably went to higher education and went to get your associate's degree or your bachelor's degree, maybe even further, right? Why is that? It's because we believe that if you gain wisdom, if you gain knowledge and experience, that it will help you in life, right? So we would think these things would be a good thing, a noble pursuit through a wise man. But all that being said, in verse 14, we see what Solomon thinks about this pursuit of meaning through wisdom. And what he says is, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. So even all this stuff that we think about, right? We think about, what does the smartest people say? Like, what are the innovations? What are the thoughts and philosophies of the day? What did Solomon see through his wisdom? Through his wisdom, what he says, when I pursued wisdom, it was vanity, hevel, and it was grasping for the wind. That's what he says it is. So just imagine, all of this learning, all of the reading, all of the studying, and he says it's just like grabbing after the wind, chasing the wind, right? Ultimately, there's not really any tangible fulfillment there. So what we're going to see then through the rest of this chapter in verses 15 to 8 is he's going on to explain why it's vanity. Why is it chasing or grasping after the wind? And so what we're going to see is him explaining the limitations of worldly wisdom and human knowledge. And in verse 15, I think what we see is the answer to life's biggest questions are beyond mere humans. There are going to be questions, there's going to be problems, things that we face on this side of eternity under the sun that we just ultimately, it's just beyond us, right? There are things that are just greater than us. And in verse 15, what we see is actually a short little proverb, which a proverb is not just a book of the Bible or a verse in that book of the Bible. A proverb is just any short, pithy saying that would have been memorized for wisdom or to apply to your life. And what verse 15 says is, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. So what he's saying, he's not saying that anything that has ever been crooked cannot be straight. What he's saying is there are certain things in life that are crooked, that cannot be made straight. So what he's basically saying is that there are certain things in which, as we think about them, there are many things that we are powerless in our life to change. So there are bad things in this life that we're all aware of, right? And you just, no matter how much knowledge you obtain, you just can't change it. And so just think, there are examples like people, right? There are people that we cannot manage, right? There are people that we would like to change or fix or convince or pray for, and then ultimately they just continue to do what they're going to do, causing problems, right? Doing wicked things in the world. There are just certain things with people that we cannot manage. There are problems that we cannot solve, right? There are things that we just know that ultimately are outside of our own control. And then finally, we know that there are certain longings that we have that cannot ultimately be satisfied, right? He actually explained that in the very beginning of chapter 1. So we see there are problems with people, there are problems in general, and there are longings that we have. And we experience a sense of longing or dissatisfaction without being able to pinpoint the exact cause. And that's kind of the second part of this proverb. And what is lacking cannot be numbered. That is, there are certain things that we feel in our lives that we know that there's something missing, right? But we can't necessarily pinpoint it in our human wisdom. As I said, as I'm emphasizing worldly wisdom and human knowledge, right? So in our humanity, there are just certain things that we just recognize in our ongoing day-to-day experience that we're like, there's something missing. There's more than this. There's more than just reading a book, just learning some information, right? So there's this proverb explaining that there's these things in life that we just can't ultimately always fix, and there are these things that we feel like we're missing, and we just can't really pinpoint exactly what it is. So he's explaining that there's this struggle that we're experiencing even as we start to obtain wisdom. And in verses 16 to 17, as I've already read 16, where it's once again referring to how much wisdom Solomon has obtained. But with 16 and 17, what we also see is that after he's perceived all of this and he's obtained all of this knowledge, he says that once again, in verse 17, it's like grasping after the wind. So now he's said this multiple times already, and he's saying that after he sought after human wisdom, what he says is it does not bring ultimate fulfillment. That's the point that he's making. We have a lot of big problems in this world, and we're not finding fulfillment. And then at verse 18, he gets even more depressing by saying this, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And in verse 18, that's kind of where I want to camp now, because that's where he kind of gives a little bit of a reason for why he keeps saying this statement about wisdom is vanity or chasing after the wind. So why? Why does he keep saying that? Why is it not satisfying him? Why is it not fulfilling him, right? Why can't it fix the crooked problems in our lives? That's basically the big thing we keep asking ourselves as we're probably hearing and reading him, right? Well, in verse 18, he gives us the answer, and what he says is the increased knowledge, right, as he continues to gain the wisdom, gain the knowledge, all it did was increase his sorrow. It increased his grief, his vexation. He's just getting more and more frustrated as he was gaining all of this knowledge and wisdom under the sun. And you might be wondering, well, why is that? Why was wisdom or knowledge giving him grief, vexation, and sorrow? Well, there's a common phrase that many of us probably have heard before: ignorance is bliss. Right? You've probably heard of that before. Why is it? Because it's really simple when you're ignorant. It is. You don't have near as many problems, right? Or think of a child. And ignorant doesn't mean stupid, by the way. Ignorant just means you don't have information. You're unaware of certain things. So children, like, in the large scheme of things, that they're ignorant on a lot of topics. And we see how cheerful they are because they're innocent and ignorant. But as you increase in knowledge, and as you increase in wisdom, what he's explaining is that it causes more grief in your life. So why is that? Well, I think that there's at least 6 things that I can draw from why it increases in sorrow. The first one is that when you gain knowledge, what you do is you become more aware of the pain and suffering in the world. Right? A kid doesn't really even know much about the pain and suffering of the world, right? There's even some people that probably don't take their children or grandchildren to maybe a funeral, right? Because they can't fully understand it. They don't even really know. You say that they went to go be with maybe Jesus, or we're not going to see them for a while, or they went to sleep. You say these different things, but they don't really understand it. And now as they get a little bit older, they start to, right? But it's just this, unawareness of what's going on in the world. And we see that as you study wars, as you study sickness, death, if you work at a hospital or if you work in law enforcement, you start to learn and experience how dark this world really is. I know that in ministry, there's certain things that you don't know as just a church member. You don't know the ins and outs of what's really plaguing the congregation and what's going on through your communities. But sometimes as a minister, you get to actually be more aware of those things because people will come and seek counsel or confide in you. And so what you do is you notice that as you gain more knowledge, it actually will show you how sad this world really is, that this world really is fallen. So I think that's at least one reason, that as you become more aware, you start to see the pain and the suffering in the world. I think you also, number 2, is you become frustrated with those who are unwise, right? Think about that. As you gain more information, right, as you become more wise, you start to see people that aren't very wise, right? And the thing is, in this day and age, we have, electronics, we have social media, and you get to see how unwise many people are, right? And now this could be for a couple of reasons. This could be the ignorant category, where people they really just don't have the information yet, and so they're saying things that really doesn't make a lot of sense because they just haven't gained enough information. But then there are also those who have IQ differences, right? There are people that generally just are able to grasp information, consolidate it better than others. And so the thing is that as you gain more knowledge and as you start to really, especially if you've been like this, maybe you've studied a topic really, really well and in depth, and like you really have a handle of the material, and you just go and maybe you're talking about it or it's been brought up in conversation, and then someone all of a sudden comes into the conversation, they start giving their strong opinion, and you can tell they haven't read or listened to anybody that is well-rounded or studied on this topic, right? It's really annoying almost, right? You're like, I want to love you, I want to respect you, I want to have a conversation with you, but it's like, you have a lot you need to learn. And I think that this is probably something that Solomon was dealing with. I can't even imagine Jesus, right? Jesus walking around listening to what his disciples were talking about, him being, who he is. But just imagine, though, Solomon, as he's walking around and he's hearing those people that many of them were illiterate, many of them weren't schooled at all. So he was around these people, and it could have been frustrating in the sense that they were ignorant or not very intelligent, and they were giving their thoughts, and everyone has an opinion, right? Everyone has opinions on different subjects. So that could be another one. We also know that as you gain wisdom or knowledge, that it can also potentially lead to pride, right? That we know that knowledge puffs up, right? Knowledge can make you a proud person because as you see people that don't have certain information that you do, right, or aren't maybe as inclined to, knowledge or logic as you may be, you can maybe actually, it can lead to your peril, right? We just spoke a message on the peril of pride through the book of Obadiah. And we see how pride can lead to a fall. It can lead to destruction. And so, in fact, your own knowledge can lead to your own demise. So I think that maybe he's recognizing that there's maybe something going internally with him, that he's dealing with pride as he gains more knowledge. So we see there's pain and suffering you become aware of. You can become frustrated with the unwise. Number 3, you can become prideful, which can lead to your own peril. And number 4, I think we see a paradox with wisdom. And I think the paradox is that the more knowledge you gain, seemingly the less things you seem to actually know. Right? Or the more knowledge you gain, the more you seem to lack. It's a paradox, right? And many of you have probably figured this out, right? As you start to learn more stuff, you realize, oh, wow, I didn't know anything about this topic. I didn't realize that there were so many more, delicate information and smaller things that come in and go with this connection point. So maybe an example of this would be like the book of Revelation, right? Some people, all you know about the book of Revelation is like, it's this book at the back of the Bible. It talks about some maybe future things and some weird things in it, and it's really, difficult to understand, and maybe that's it. And now at least you have something to say that's what it is. But now as you start to study eschatology and you study, which you might not even know what eschatology was. I'm already throwing something new in there, right? You have to study eschatology, then you have to understand the millennium. You have to understand that there's an idealist perspective, there's a preterist, a futurist perspective. Within the futurist, that there's different perspectives, that doesn't even address the millennial issue of pre, post, and millennial, and even within those groups that you can see that as a pre-mill, you could be a dispensationalist or a pre-trib or a post-trib or a mid-trib. And within those, you can see that there's different symbols, and the symbols within that same group can be different. You see, you didn't maybe know all of that, right? But that's how life is all the time. We're all just like, we don't know this information, right? But as you start to really study in depth, you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And what I've found as I study, anytime I come to teach or preach on a topic, every time I learn one thing, I have about 3 other questions that arise. And it's so frustrating, and maybe you've been like that before. Because I'll be going through a rabbit trail of studying and reading through another book and a commentary or doing a Google search. I'm like, what is this? I never thought about this before. How does this connect with this verse over here? Now my theology is all crazy because I got to somehow harmonize these scriptures, right? Or how is this going to work, right? So I think that that's what he's maybe experiencing as well, is the more you gain in knowledge, the more you seem to lack. It's just, you just keep feeling, consumed. It's almost like if you were trying to get a bucket and pull out the water from the ocean, and you see how you keep doing it and you realize how much more water there is. It's like, that's what it is. It's the waters of wisdom. They're infinite. And it's just like, as you learn, you're like, you got your bucket, but then you're like, there's the ocean, right? So I think that we see this paradox of the more knowledge you gain, the more you seem to lack. And I think that could also lead to grief and frustration. Number 5 is you cannot retain all the information you have gathered. This is another one that is super frustrating, and maybe you have experienced this. Even if you have gained this knowledge, you've learned it, you've read it, you've studied it, there are so many times that you have forgotten it, right? I go up to preach and teach all the time, and that's why I have notes, because once I've studied it, even if I understand the material, you'll forget things. And there's still, every time I preach or teach, there's things that I wanted to say, or I wanted to say it a certain way, and I forgot it in the moment. But that's the thing, is that's the reality of life, is even though all of these things that we've read and studied and heard, we forget a lot of it. I think, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I heard it's a really, really, really small percentage of like a book or something that you actually even recall and remember and actually take and root in your memory for life. It's very, very small of what we actually retain. And it's almost like, if you use the water analogy again, it's like you keep putting water in the boat, but the boat has a leak in it. And so it just or in a cup or, a pail, and the pail has a hole in it. And so water just keeps getting out as you keep filling it. It's this frustration of you're gathering information, but you don't get to keep it, which actually kind of leads to the 6th and final thing, which is that even if you gained all of the knowledge of the earth, and even if you were able to retain it all for this life, there's something that happens, and that's death. And I'm not going to hit too hard on this because in chapter 2, he's going to talk about death specifically and how it's the end of all people and how he's going to explain how death is the great equalizer. And so I'm not going to spend too much time, but one thing that Solomon finds out as he's pursuing these things is that death comes to the wise and to the fool. So it doesn't matter how wise or how foolish you are, ultimately, that information that you've gained, you die, right? So I think that all of these different things could be reasons, and I'm sure maybe you can think of even more, and maybe there were other things that Solomon was dealing with that was causing him this, but just to go over those through quickly one more time. You become more aware of the pain and suffering of the world. You become frustrated with those who are unwise. You become prideful, which can lead to your peril. The more knowledge you gain, the more you seem to lack. You cannot retain all the information you have gathered, and death comes both to the wise and to the fool. So I think these are some good examples of how he's expressing this grief and this sorrow that comes with this gained wisdom and knowledge. So I think it's clear that Solomon is making this point for us, that limitations of worldly wisdom and human knowledge, that there are these things that just, it's just not good enough. It's not going to ultimately satisfy us. So what's the answer to this problem? And we kind of addressed it last week, and we'll probably continue to address it through this book, and that's what the author, or that's what Solomon's trying to get us to, is to avoid the vexation of the worldly wisdom. What we need to do is we need divine revelation. See, though it's great to know about science, it's great to know calculus, it's good to know how, to do certain things in this world and to hear these different thought processes, like all of this is good. Wisdom can be very good for us and life-giving to us. But ultimately, if you want to get out of this grief, this vexation, this cycle of you just get it and then you lose it and you got to regain it and all these things, what we need is we actually need something that's greater than it, because our worldly knowledge can only get us so far. We need special revelation, divine revelation that comes through the Lord. And that's what we see is true wisdom and true fulfillment come from a proper relationship with God. That's what I think Solomon wants us to get clear within our minds and our hearts. Proverbs 1:7, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." And then Proverbs 9:10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So these are what these Proverbs are saying. What they're saying is that if you want true wisdom, you have to have a fear of the Lord. And that word fear doesn't just mean like, be afraid he's going to strike you or smite you. It's having a proper respect and reverence and awe of who God is. So to have true wisdom that's going to fulfill you and satisfy you beyond just the things under the sun is you need to actually have and see the majesty of who God is. You have to understand his glory. And as you start to understand that, you'll start to find out that that's where the true fulfillment in life and the meaning of life comes from. And so to seek wisdom then by itself, or to seek wisdom as an end in itself, we see that you're missing the purpose of wisdom. See, wisdom begins and ends with God. And so if you take God out of the equation, then your wisdom is going to be lacking. And I think that's kind of the point, because as you notice in this section, just like he did earlier, he's mentioning being under the sun or under the heavens. So that's pointing us once again that there's something that must be beyond it. So he's wanting you to see what life is like through the lens of human wisdom or worldly wisdom apart from divine wisdom. And so that's why it's so important that we understand that when we come to these different philosophies, these different people, these smart people, we have to always go back to what does God's wisdom say? What is God showing us? And that's why it's important that whenever I preach or teach that I'm not just giving you my thoughts or opinions, but I'm always trying to back it up and teach through what the Bible says. Because the good news is that God doesn't leave us in our grief. God doesn't leave us in this vexation or sorrow of worldly wisdom. Rather, God gives us and grants us his divine wisdom. It says that God is rich and gracious in giving those who seek it and ask for it wisdom. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23 and 24, it says, "But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. So what this is saying is when you think about the message of Christ and him crucified, when you think about the gospel message, what we're actually seeing is that God himself has given us his son, Jesus. And who is Jesus? It says that Jesus is both the power of God and he is the wisdom of God. So if you want to seek and be fulfilled and satisfied, you can't just be looking through the things of the world. You have to find it in the gospel. You have to find it in the person of Jesus, because Jesus is actually the incarnation of God's wisdom. If you want a wisdom that transcends the world, that takes you out of this vexation, you have to trust and seek Christ. That's where the fear of the Lord comes in. It's a relationship with God's Son. So we find Christ, who is the wisdom of God, and then we can actually find then the meaning of life. And then what we should do then is not boast in our own wisdom, but we should boast in God's wisdom, or boast in God's glory, which is the final thing I want to share with you as we close. Jeremiah 9:23-24, it says, "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, let not the mighty man glory in his might, nor let the rich man glory in his riches, but let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, exercising loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in these I delight, says the Lord." So what this is saying is, don't boast in these things of the world, whether it's your wisdom, whether it's your power, whether it's your riches. The thing that we need to boast in is that we can find and glory in a relationship with him. It says, he who understands and knows me. So if you want to find true satisfaction, if you want true wisdom that will meet your needs and actually point to the meaning of life, it's called delight and understand who God is, and we ultimately see that through divine revelation in his son, Jesus Christ, on the cross. So the gospel, the person of Jesus, is what gives us true meaning and true fulfillment found in God's wisdom.